Hi everyone, thanks for that introduction, Lucy. My name's James from Mikhail Riches. I was the associate in charge of Goldsmith Street, and I've been listening in this afternoon to all of the various talks. And I think one of the things that really has come across to me is, you know, as a sort of practicing architect, the kind of nervousness within the industry to kind of engage with low carbon design. And I think people are slightly daunted by it. And I think our approach to sustainability is very much kind of ground up and keep it simple, which might be at odds with what a lot of people think, especially given all of the facts and figures and numbers that are being thrown around to do with both embodied carbon and carbon kind of energy in use. And hopefully today this presentation will kind of demystify a lot of that and try and keep things simple, and therefore be a kind of useful tool for everyone to sort of take away and use in their own practice. And there might be some surprising things that you find from this talk. So I'm going to put this talk in context of the practice's kind of wider portfolio. In particular, I don't think Goldsmith Street is the kind of, you know, that's where we are. It's very much a sort of chapter 2 in the evolution of the practice's kind of portfolio. And what I mean by that is I think, you know, I think it's fair to say that kind of chapter 1 in that sense would be a much smaller scheme. So Clay Fields in Suffolk, which was a solar design, not a passive house design, and I'll expand on that in the talk. Goldsmith Street was conceived very much at the same time as Clay Fields and was won at a competition back in 2008, an RIBA competition, might I add, given RIBA's event today. And you can see from the date there that for 100 homes, it's taken over 10 years. And the reason for that is it was won at competition and then it stalled due to the financial crash. And then when it was picked back up, the client asked us to take the scheme that we designed at competition and bring it all the way up to passive house standard. And we kind of said, yeah, we'll give it a go. And that will obviously be the kind of bulk of today's talk. But alongside that, you know, the practice is looking at a much wider spectrum of sustainability sort of objectives. And given the previous talk sort of focused on reuse, our Park Hill project in Sheffield for nearly 200 homes for Urban Splash looks to reuse the existing concrete frame on the UK's largest listed building. And also the brick facade, so retaining as much structure, bringing it up to a kind of a sensible environmental standard, and creating new homes out of ones which were previously unused. And then jumping up in scale again, the practice back in 2018 won a joint competition working with others called Velo City, which looked at the Oxford-Cambridge corridor for the National Infrastructure Commission. And this was looking at how you could sustainably grow villages using sustainable transport methods, in particularly the bike. So kind of looking at live work, kind of very poignant given the current climate, and yeah, sort of general sustainable growth within communities. And lastly, just looking at what's on the drawing board at the moment, so to speak. We're working on a 600 home master plan for the LLDC next to the Olympic Park. So very much looking at kind of zero carbon housing in London and building at density. And then at the same time, we're applying the learnings from Goldsmith Street with the City of York across 9 sites. Each of them, or sorry, all of them looking to achieve passive house standards, so 100% passive house. And also their objective is to get as close to possible as net zero carbon. Something I did just as part of this presentation was actually kind of do a rewind, and I'm glad that it's been mentioned several times today, the things I'm just about to run through, but I think it's useful to kind of look back at the slide I've just presented and also the policy and context that we're working in as an industry, and kind of zipping back to, so 10 years, but actually slightly even more to 2006, the main kind of document we had to kind of use as a kind of benchmark for sustainability was the Code for Sustainable Homes. And, you know, I think that it really lacked the kind of facts and figures that I've kind of said we're all slightly scared of these days. But at the same time, you know, a tick box list didn't really feel appropriate for the kind of complexity of the challenge that we're trying to deal with here. Interestingly, also sort of 10 years ago, we had the first ever UK certified passive house back in 2009. And I think what's really interesting, Goldsmith Street was the phase that we completed now for nearly 100 homes represents one of the largest kind of single kind of group specified set of passive houses, but that's almost 10 years on. So you can see it's been a very slow build up to where we are today. And I think kind of moving over the last 10 years, we've had the building regs. I think they've not really caught up with where, you know, the industry kind of feels they should be. And at the same time, you know, over that past 10 years, you know, last year really kind of represented a pivotal moment, I think, in across the industry and the world to a point, with, you know, UK architects declare a climate emergency, and at the same time, Goldsmith Street kind of coming out as this sort of almost benchmark project for people to kind of look to as a potential way of actually achieving all of these targets that we're being asked to do. Interestingly enough, the last time a climate emergency was declared was back in 2006, very much aligning with the Code for Sustainable Homes. So what does the next 10 years look like? Well, we've got the building regs change coming up imminently, with groups like LETI challenging that. And I think architects are much more versed now with how and, you know, how and why we should be challenging these things. And equally, we've got our own kind of industry body kind of setting out the 2030 climate challenge. And I think Goldsmith Street is a kind of good example of actually what that looks like. So to very kind of quickly go through chapter 1, as I sort of inferred, being Clay Fields in Suffolk, which was, you know, a much smaller project, 26 homes. The key ideas were a low embodied carbon construction using hemp lime construction and lots of timber. A low energy passive solar design, so using the sun as a means of heating. And I think what it really benefited from was a post-occupancy analysis, which was done by Bureau Happold, and I think was one of the most intensive post-occupancy analysis done for a very long time. And some of the lessons that we've taken from that have then been applied to our later projects. So just very quickly as an overview of Clay Fields, what it's really kind of done well is, from a master plan point of view, is a series of east-west staggered terraces, which, you know, give maximum exposure for solar gains. Also a kind of landscape-led master plan which integrates small children's play, but also community growing, and, you know, rather than it something that's being led by the car, actually focusing on the user experience and creating communities. So here you have a view of from the football pitch. In particular, note the kind of sloping roof lines. So on this section here, you can see this is one of the things that the practice really took as a lesson learned from Clayfield, or what worked really well, and that was the solar strategy in particular. So very simple, east-west terraces, combined with kind of really thinking carefully about where the sun comes from and making sure one building doesn't overshadow another. Obviously, other things that came out of it was, you know, noting the kind of more complex stuff, such as ventilation strategies, overheating. You know, did the heating system work well? No, it didn't work as well as we were hoping. But I think, you know, things have moved on a lot in the last 10 years, the modeling software that's available, and that is one of the things that we've taken through into Goldsmith Street. So you can see here just views of how the landscape and SUD strategy was integrated. And in particular, I think one of the key things was how things like community gardens can be used as a vehicle for people getting to know each other. So as much as we've spoken a lot about carbon today, actually things like food miles, a much more holistic view to sustainability is important. And alongside that, you know, creating sustainable communities is not just about your carbon intensity, it's actually making great places for people to live. So small children's play, observable from a kitchen window, very simple things, but actually very effective. So coming forward to the present day, as I said, you know, we see Goldsmith Street as a sort of chapter 2, a sort of pivotal moment now in terms of how are things going to change over the next 10 years. I'm sure, you know, everyone knows a lot about the project, and I'm going to try and touch on things that maybe people don't know, but, you know, you'll see a lot of the themes here run through from our Clay Field scheme. So a low energy passive solar design, that was one of the lessons learned and brought through that was successful. The key thing was that, you know, this wasn't designed as a passive house scheme from the outset. This was a brief change from the client and a sort of challenge that they laid down to us to make it passive house. And luckily that very simple move of having a solar orientated master plan actually made the change from a design level very simple. From a technical level, you know, that's where the detail had to come. So another thing that we've learned, and I'll expand on later, is a low embodied carbon construction. A lot of people don't realise that Goldsmith Street is a timber frame hidden behind our kind of brick skin. And also I think a lot of the things that were just touched on about kind of whole life carbon, maintenance costs, really thinking about materials is something that we've done but weren't necessarily kind of cognizant of it at the time. But I think interestingly, as a local authority development, it really did set the benchmark out for building super sustainable homes, in particular 100% social housing. And that was done at low cost and to a really high quality using a traditional JCT contract. So the square meter rate was around 1875 a square meter. So what is Passive House? I'm glad someone's already touched on this today. In really simple terms, it's reducing energy use of a typical 2-bed house down to around £150 a year. So that is the kind of user experience. And you can see against the current building regs, a drastic reduction in energy use. And for me, I'm a big Passive House kind of advocate, because I think it's a kind of shorthand for delivering highly sustainable, low energy homes. And it can be taken a step further. This is what I think the future looks like, where actually we had no renewables on Goldsmith Street. And one of the steps that we could be looking to do in the future, and in particular our York project, which I'll talk about later, is actually then introducing renewables to take that energy use down to 0 per year, so net zero carbon in terms of energy use. I think one of the key things that again has been touched on today is about the performance gap. And again, Passive House is a shorthand for removing the performance gap from design because of the quality control that's kind of embedded in the process. And almost you don't have to think about it as a designer, it's there because it is so stringent. And I think over the lifespan of a building, you can see that it is a huge difference in terms of energy consumption. Just a quickly overview on the scheme. We modelled the scheme on the local Victorian housing, which was north-south streets, but we noted that the street distance was 14 metres on the streets and 14 metres to the gardens. And we kind of brought that master plan up to date by orientating it through 90 degrees and actually creating east-west streets that are perfectly orientated for solar gains, but using those same 14 metres for shared communal gardens. Looking through the site section, you have a series of streets and gardens with north and south end to terraces, with that site section carefully calibrated to maximise solar gains and avoid overshadowing. Again, that lesson learnt from Clayfields. Looking at the master plan in a little bit more detail, I think one of the most successful spaces has been these Ginnell spaces between terraces 2, 4, 3 and 5. And that is a space where safe small children's play, again, an idea taken from Clayfields and kind of incorporated at a bigger scale, has been really successful. So one of the things that we've also really considered is kind of privacy to ground floors, the user experience of front doors directly onto the street, and also concealing things like meter boxes. Again, all of this is 100% Passive House and incredibly low in terms of its energy demand. This is probably one of the most successful spaces on the scheme, as I've touched on already. Small children are allowed to access this freely from kind of semi-private garden spaces. And I think, it's been a real joy for us to kind of see this space being used as we kind of anticipated in the design. Just to touch on how we've got the density. So at the end of each terrace, as you can see on the diagram in the top left, we have big houses, as we call them. And these are 3 stacked 1-bed flats. In particular, the real success story here is that everyone has their own front door. What I mean by that, there are no common parts onto the scheme, and every front door faces directly onto the street. So users get a real sense of ownership and control over their domain. And I think this is one of the things that from a design point of view will hopefully make this scheme kind of last in perpetuity. So taking out the problems and kind of ensuring that, we're creating a really successful community. And just to wrap up this section on Goldsmith Street, I think it's been really amazing for us to kind of revisit the scheme and just seeing how residents are using the space. And I think I've sort of put this slide up to kind of say, what has really worked is the passive house strategy. We know from user feedback and residents that they are genuinely not having to put their heating on. And that is something that makes a real difference. So the lessons learned, we're only halfway there. You'll note at the moment, I barely touched on embodied carbon in terms of materials, that is. And I put this slide in just to kind of demonstrate where we are relative to that. So Goldsmith Street performs incredibly well against the RIBA 2030 targets, and that is primarily down to passive house. This figure could be taken down to zero by the use of renewables. In terms of embodied carbon in the materials, we're doing well, but we're not quite there. Our main objective was to achieve passive house, and this is something that's actually come almost without us fully engaging with the topic. And then lastly, water demand. Again, we're doing well against the targets, but there's still a long way to go. Just in terms of actually what all these things look like from a kind of simplistic point of view, it's been touched on really well in the last presentation, so I'll kind of keep it brief. But, we've got our materials. These were offset by the use of timber frame and warm cell insulation in the construction. And then the other uses have brought the whole life carbon assessment to around 311 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. So it's doing well without us kind of fully engaging. I think there's a lot of work we could still do on this. The second point that I've kind of put in here to sort of for everyone to take away is to get the master plan right. It seems like an incredibly simple thing to say, and I think one of the things that both of these schemes have demonstrated is that in getting the master plan right, you're halfway there to fight, dealing with a lot of these challenges that we face in terms of energy and use and trying to reduce carbon. And this is something that we've taken on to the projects that the practice is working on at the moment across the board. There's obviously lots more than this. And it's an incredibly simple strategy, but it's something that you kind of have to keep telling yourself to do, is think about where the sun's coming from, think about free energy, and kind of make sure that's embedded in the design. And the last point, again, this might seem, I'm sorry for the pun here, but it needn't cost the earth. What do I mean by that? Well, we've spoken in the last presentation about materials, maintenance, how you take the building apart at the end of the day. And I think that is something that we did do in a lot of detail on Goldsmith Street. So considering where the bricks came from, considering how use of kind of metal guttering will increase maintenance life. And I think that's been a very effective way of really engaging as an architect with carbon, not through kind of numbers, but actually thinking through it on a kind of practical level. And this last slide, I think, value engineering can be beautiful. I think the thing we touched on in the last presentation is how the buildings come apart, how alternative materials can be used to kind of really elegantly complete a design. These roofs were never originally glossy black pan tiles, clay pan tiles. We had zinc in. And I think there's a real story here in kind of architect-led value engineering that can not only, save on carbon, but actually enhance the design and save the client money. And that's me kind of done.
Thanks so much, James. I might kick off with a couple of questions of my own, if that's okay, and then maybe see if there's any coming through on the chat. So my first question actually maybe broadens this out a little bit. So Goldsmith Street, as I'm sure you're aware, has become a bit of a kind of poster project, and it's been widely used as an exemplar across actually to illustrate lots of different kind of agendas, including kind of political agendas. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on what its kind of popular appeal is down to, and whether it kind of gives you any hope that there will be kind of client and consumer demand for the most sustainable housing in future.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we as a practice have seen in the last 12 months just an amazing uptake of local authorities declaring climate emergencies and then going, but we don't know how to do it. And I think, if anything kind of good has come out of the last year, it's that actually it can be seen as as you say, a kind of poster child, or a kind of, for me, it's a kind of vehicle for this is how you can do it. And I think I've obviously kind of flown through a lot of information today, but you know, I think it can be, sustainability and all these targets can be overcomplicated. And I think in particular at the moment, you know, everyone sort of doesn't know which way to go with it. And actually, I think if you employ the right consultant team, you know, you can kind of be advising the client on the best route forward. But, you know, I think Goldsmith shows that you using kind of simple way, like means such as Passive House, you can get that energy and use down very easily as a kind of strategy. And as I say, for us as a practice, it's become a shorthand for doing that. And now that's allowed us to start engaging with things like embodied carbon in construction, which we've got a huge, we've got a long way to go with it. And I think, it's a really interesting area that is only going to change over the next 10 years.
And do you think it could even be sort of a project like Goldsmith Street could even be kind of distilled into, I don't know, design principles, almost a design code? You mentioned the importance of kind of looking at a kind of bigger spatial scale at the kind of site layout and master planning.
Yeah, and that's what I've tried. Well, I've tried to distill that in today's presentation. I appreciate kind of flying through it, but there are some really simple steps that you can make to, taking those ideas that we've put in Goldsmith Street, and they're very transferable, and I think they're very scalable, and I think the practice has demonstrated that over the last 10 years and will be hopefully over the next 10. And that's where it almost feels kind of slightly apologetic to say, actually just orientate your buildings well and kind of think about window proportions and the specifications of your materials. But actually, that's where, for me, I think as an architect, I think actually kind of simplifying a lot of this stuff makes it a lot more tangible and a lot easier to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Quick question here coming through from Sarah Harrison on the chat. So she says that Goldsmith Street is an exemplar on construction budget. Was there any extra over on the consultant team fees?
I think in terms of Passive House design, we didn't know what we were doing with it. I think you gave that as an intro, thankfully. And I think we've been through a huge learning curve. I mean, I had the benefit of having done some private residential, so kind of understanding it at a small scale. I think from a client's point of view, there are 2 additional fees that they have to be aware of, and that is your Passive House designer and also your Passive House certifier. That's it. In terms of the architect fees, there's a question over, is there more complexity and therefore more fees? And I would say yes. I think there are lots more iterations that you have to go through with that additional consultant that you brought to the team. But I don't think it's not an exponential cost. I often, we've been challenged as to why we don't have Passive House designers within the practice. And I think my sort of response to that is, we don't have structural engineers, and we very much have a team of consultants that we have under our wing that we work with incredibly closely. And I think it's a very enjoyable process to work with a consultant team where everyone's bouncing off each other and you all know the constraints that you're working with. So, and I think PH Ribbon was kind of mentioned, and that is a kind of almost like a bolt-on to the PHPP package, which is kind of bringing the Passive House energy design and embodied carbon design sort of much closer together. And I think that's going to evolve over the next 10 years.
And one final question, which is around, obviously, learning is central to your practice. Do you have any kind of formal processes or platforms for sharing knowledge within the practice team or indeed across project teams?
I think we try and share as much as possible. I don't feel like we're hiding the solutions under our under our hands. I think doing events like this is a really good way of sharing this, and we've been very open. I think all the way through the construction of Goldsmith Street, we were running probably once a month workshops on site where we invited local authorities in particular, to come and see it. And I think, local authorities offer an amazing vehicle for actually upping the benchmark and the quality standard of sustainable housing, especially as kind of owners of that housing stock, or custodians, I think it was said earlier. And I think that is where, we can't get away from the fact that building to this higher standard does cost more than the absolute kind of minimum. But I think there is a question over, does it pay for itself over its lifespan? Well, of course it does. And I think that's where, actually, I think if there's a refocusing of finance and how money is spent on a project and kind of looking at that, 60-year lifespan in a bit more detail, actually, I think all of the things that have been spoken about today, I think the financial offset at the beginning actually just almost disappears, in my view, without any kind of numbers to back it up. So I think is that answering the question?